by the way, that issue that Jeffrey mentioned, that just before we go back to him, Jeff, you were talking, Jeffrey, about the fact that the resources that have been deployed, we should not allow them to go to waste. At the very least, INEC must have printed at the very least 2 million something ballot papers for the governorship elections across all of the areas. Now, the number of people that come out to vote is just the number that will use it. What it signifies, Jeff, then would be that we would have wasted a lot of resources if people don't come out to vote. I'm just wondering if that's part of the issues that you'll be taking up with your next guest in your next conversation, Jeff.
You're spot on. The first thing I want to say is that we have only one country and we have only one thing to do, the responsibility to build that country. No matter what we think about that country, is our responsibility. Divinity has a reason why it brought us here. And so no matter how flawed the system is, it's important that we don't lose faith in our own country. So sometimes when we see voter apathy, it's a sign of losing faith in the electoral process itself. That's why we do our best as multi-stakeholders to appeal. Even though it's difficult because psychologically it's not easy to walk over. But the right person to actually answer some of those questions is right here with me. Samson Itodo is the Executive Director of Yiaga Africa. Samson, good to see you here again.
Thank you very much.
Always available.
I can see you're sweating, all right?
Yeah. Yeah, nature is kind, so I'm already sweating. Okay. But my colleague asked a question. I always like to segue from the conversation I have with my colleagues, and that has to do with the resources that have been deployed as against what becomes a turnout of voters. But Yiaga, for instance, has done his own analytics. Walk us through what you have seen and why this concern is still quite important.
I think this concern is very important because if you look at this election, you have over 2 million registered voters. If INEC is preparing for this election, it budgets for every voter. So taxpayers' money is spent to produce those ballot papers and the result sheets. Now, a situation where a small fraction of voters show up, what you eventually get at the end of the day is that as a country we would have wasted hundreds of millions just printing ballot papers when voters don't show up. And that's why there's actually the cost implication of not turning up to cast your vote. The second dimension is when you look at the personnel deployed, especially security personnel. Over 55,000 security personnel have been deployed for this election. The security agencies have assured the people of Anambra that they will provide a secure environment to turn up to vote. So quite frankly, I don't see any excuse why people will not turn up to vote, save for maybe reasons attributed to perhaps either they have grievance with the quality of governance or the lack of trust in the electoral process. But INEC has demonstrated, as you can see in this polling unit, we have INEC officials arriving here at 7:07 a.m. I was in this particular polling unit 4 years ago. That's the community primary school. And I can tell you that as at 7:07 a.m. 4 years ago, polling officials had not arrived at this polling unit. And I'm seeing all the reports coming in, whether it's from Ihala, that is also facing with security problems. We see INEC officials arriving early at some of those polling units. Because one thing that is underpinning this election, Geoffrey, is the efficiency test. Because historically, from 2013 to 2017 to 2021, INEC has never recorded early commencement of voting in Anambra State, but we're looking forward to seeing them breaking the jinx. So we're keeping an eye on what will happen across the entire state. And in an hour or two, we will be in a good position to provide, a percentage of the number of polling units that have commenced accreditation and voting early.
We are in the city center, so we're not familiar what's going on in the hinterland, especially the riverine areas.
Yeah.
But they are watching us, giving assurances to the effect that the federal government has assured that security is being deployed. We keep reeling out that number. 45,000 policemen, 10,000 NSCDC officials, maybe other ancillaries as well, to support the security formation, to make sure that voters are protected. In fact, as a matter of fact, for every polling unit, there's supposed to be two unarmed policemen stationed at a particular distance away from the polling booth for where voters will cast their votes, so that everything is properly done and people are confident that nobody's going to harm them for whatever choice they make in terms of who they vote for. But it looks like the more we say these things, the more people are just getting a little bit more pessimistic. Why? Why the persistence?
Well, because they haven't seen, you know, any evidence to the contrary. Because you'd see situations where assurances have been made that you have this number of security officials. When you go to the field, sometimes you discover that these officials are not present in some of the polling units. In other cases, if you have a well-secured environment, how come you still have incidents of either violence or snatching of ballot boxes or even intimidation of voters, despite assurances provided by the security agencies? The good thing about this election is so far so good. We haven't recorded any incidents that actually undermines the security of this election. I said so far. The elections have just commenced. If I get, well, the opening, once polling stations open, we are deemed to say that elections have actually commenced. But accreditation and voting is yet to commence. But if you look at those hotspots, and most of them are largely in Anambra South, where you have Ihalas, the Enewis, and you also see places like Agwata. That is a battleground local government, senatorial district, because most of the candidates, at least for the major political parties, come from that particular state. However, in Anambra Central and Oka South and Idemili North, these two local governments are battleground local governments because Idemili has over 200,000 registered voters, and that local government has over 8% of registered voters, and then Oka South has about 7% of registered voters. So if a candidate secures majority of votes in Oka South and Idemili North and gets 1/3 of votes in 2/3 of local governments in the state, he is able to clinch victory. So when you look at it, you also need to look at the deployments of security in those locations. Our expectation in places like Ihala, where in 6 wards they have been modified or consolidated voting, that enough security will be deployed. I can see even from the reports that at least in Ihala and even in riverine areas, INEC officials are deploying materials to those polling stations. So let's give them the benefit of doubt and urge the Anambra people to show up, you know, to cast your vote, because this is a festival of democracy. This is one of the opportunities that you have to have a say in the way your state is being governed.
What do you make of the turnouts as against the mandates of the persons who win and how effective they can eventually govern? This is us going ahead in terms of the conversation. The last time it was 10%. That means, I use a general number.
Yeah.
If 1 million people collected their PVCs to come and vote, it means only 100,000 decided who became the governor of the state.
Yeah.
How does that affect governance? Because if we don't put this in context, people may not really be able to appreciate.
I think the voters need to understand that it is an anomaly, it's unacceptable that a minority of people will determine for the majority. That's not the whole notion of democracy. And when you think about legitimacy and democratic legitimacy, it is derived from the people. That's why it is said that democracy is government of the people, by the people, and for the people. A situation where a small fraction of people, 10% of people, determining who becomes the governor of the state does not augur well for your democracy. In fact, whoever emerges from that process cannot boldly say that they are a representation of the popular will of the people. And that's why people need to show up, because if you don't make use of the voice and the power of your vote, then you have no reason, you have no right to question political leaders when they emerge out of elections. So this is the opportunity that you have to show up to cast your vote. Some will say their votes will not count. And we say that, at least for this particular state, I say this with a deep sense of responsibility, that when you look at the history of elections in this state, compared to other states, the levels of electoral malpractices and fraud are not as high as some of the recent elections that we see. The challenge here has always been logistics and turnout. And so if the Electoral Commission has assured the voters that their votes will count, you also have a responsibility to show up at your polling unit and cast your vote and stay there at that polling unit so that the ballots are counted, the results are collated, so you see for yourself that yes, this entire process is transparent and also credible. And so please, we call on the people of Anambra, this is the opportunity that you have. If you don't vote, just know someone else is voting for you. And that someone else may be, someone else is voting for you, and that someone else might be making a wrong choice. Because in this election, every vote matters, every vote counts.
It's almost, this is 7:53 a.m. Yeah, I'm sweating. The sun is beautiful. Samson is not sweating, by the way. I don't know why. Maybe because I'm wearing a jacket. I'll take off the jacket in just a moment.
I think you should, because it's going to be a long day.
Yes, I'll take off the jacket at some point. But just to look formal for TV, since we're used to it. Anyway, before I switch it over to Lagos and take a break, let's talk about whether or not the political parties themselves are doing enough to mobilize people. Because they have a role as well.
Yep.
Talk to us about that.
I think if there's one aspect that political parties have failed, at least the most major political parties, is in this mobilization of voters. You know, if parties are serious about electoral competition, the voters are their major clients and their major targets. And so if voters are not showing up, I think the parties need to take full responsibility. It's either they are not communicating well to the voters, or they are not reaching the voters, or the voters don't even trust them, or maybe even the candidates that they are presenting to voters, perhaps the voters don't see any reason or any hope in any of those candidates. So I think parties need to do a better job of mobilizing their voters. I've seen instances where, you know, there are attempts either to entice voters to show up. That is unacceptable. Yeah. Parties need to clearly outline, you know, developmental programs that voters, you know, can subscribe to, and then come out based on their conviction that a party stands to represent their interests and not the interest of whether they are the oligarchs or the hegemons or the money bags in the political parties.